Hello and welcome back to Shrinking Classics and Happy New Year.
Yes, Happy New Year.
It's New Year's Day when we're recording this, and so we're excited to be sharing our take on Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. I'm your host, Caleb Nelson. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and when I have my own house, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. That's one of the quotes from the book, and I just feel like that applies to myself as well. My wife always gives me a hard time because I like to have bookshelves. I'm trying to get more bookshelves so I can have more place for books. And the more shelves, the more books. So we're working on that.
I love it. And I'm Leslie Nelson. And I admit I came to read this with a little bit of prejudice and maybe some pride because I've read it before and it wasn't a favorite. I wouldn't say it's bad. It just wasn't a favorite of mine. But interestingly, since then I completed my bachelor's in marriage and family, and there's a lot of marriage in this book. So that could be something fun to talk about.
Right. And that is kind of a lot of what we're going to talk about is marriage and relationships, and also I guess it's the development of characters and how they change over time. And and also how sometimes we think our strengths are actually our faults. And we think and that we have these great like things that we think we're awesome at, but they're really blind spots that we're not too awesome at. So we'll get into all of that today, which so I'm excited for it. And I'm excited for it because just like my mom, when I first read this just a couple years ago, I didn't really like it either. It was just kind of eh. And this time around, I because I knew we were going to be doing this podcast, I was like, okay, I'm going to like this book. I'm going to make sure that I like it and have lots to talk about. And I did. I liked it better this time around, and I think part of it was just overall having the attitude that I was going to like it. So I started looking at it through a different lens and not like it was just a classic book, but mostly a book for girls. Because I think that's a problem that most guys at least get into when they read this book is that we always hear that it's a book for women, and so we don't like to read it. But this time I decided
Well,
to open my mind.
it's a romance, so understandable that generally speaking,
Right.
men don't tend to enjoy romance generally.
Yeah. It's true. And so, like I said, I tried to open my mind, and I think that helped. And
I think it definitely did. It's just what I remember. We'll get into that in a little bit. Why or what bothers me about it. It's not Jane Austen. I'm not criticizing her at all. But it's just the time period. Anyway, so I was talking to Caleb. I'm like, oh, it's just as horrible as I remember. And he says,
right.
really? I thought you'd like it because this and some of the things that we'll talk about today that you brought up helped me as I finished the book to be a little more open minded. And I ended up enjoying it more than I thought I would.
Yeah, so that's the thing. You come in and you try to set your prejudice and your pride at the door, and
That's right.
right, and you find out that you know what, maybe this book is actually better than I thought. Uh, I think it'd be a miss if we don't start the book with the opening line. It's a classic opening line. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And see, that one is it's a classic opening line because it kind of sets not only the tone for the book, but also kind of it tells you the period that they were in. And my mom and I were talking about this right before we started
Period,
that.
you mean some university school or some, religious
Right.
cultures?
Right. Like so like the time period, you know? And uh we were talking about it right before we got on here that was Jane Austen born in the Regency era, or was it just she liked to kind of talk about it? And so I checked, and yeah, she spent most of her adult life in the Regency era, and she likes to make fun of the time frame. She likes to make fun of the people and everything going on, and and so this opening line I think is kind of the first jab at not only the setting, but it also sets the tone for the book. I'm excited to kind of get into that and go through all that good stuff.
Yes, and, Caleb, I'm glad you mentioned that because, that helps me just to recognize that she lived in that time period, and in some way she was making fun of it because that is the difficulty that I have with the book is that in this time period, it's like nobody has anything to do. Like the
Right.
women just sit around and talk and largely gossip and go for walks. I'm like, I cannot relate to these people. The men, even the men, don't seem to have anything to do. It drives me crazy. But yeah. So just to know that she was kind of, if nothing else, laughing at herself, then that helps. I go, oh, okay. If you guys can have some humor about this, then I can give you a little bit of a break.
Right. Well, and ultimately, so that's kind of the meat of the story is that it's really, Jane Austen kind of almost making a satire of her time period, is that she's showing you why this whole period was ridiculous. It's a very feminist forward book, and not in a radical feminism type of way, but a good realistic type of feminist type of way. One of the things that is fun to watch out of the book is so Mrs.
Right.
Bennet.
Because there are many different
Yeah.
flavors.
Hmm.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No, do it.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry I interrupted. I just want to interject that there are many different flavors of feminism. And if people aren't familiar with it, they probably think of radical feminism, but it's really so much more than that. So, anyway, back to your point.
Right. And what we're saying by kind of the difference between radical feminism is, at least how I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but radical feminism is really more of kind of pushing that like all men are bad, and that the only way to raise up women is by putting down men. Whereas uh just kind of I don't know what to call it, good feminism, I guess,
I
is
think liberal feminism
yeah,
is
liberal
what it's called.
feminism is just where you're uh saying that, women are great, men are great, let's work together. Like, okay, well, yeah, that sounds like something everybody should be a part of. So, does that sound all right to you? I know that you were kind of the one that helped me understand those
Yes,
differences.
absolutely. And then I feel like in liberal feminism, we're just acknowledging that women haven't been always been acknowledged as having talents and something to add to society other than motherhood, which I love being a mother, so I'm not complaining about that.
Right.
Um, just that we have other gifts and talents and things to lend to the world, and that hasn't always in the past been acknowledged. But like you said, that we lift together. We just want men and women to be lifted together. So it's a very different view.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a big part about what this is all about. Is so Mrs. Bennet in this book is kind of a satirical like representation of the
I hope
period,
so.
because she is just like such a busybody. She's her entire focus in life is to make sure that her daughters get married. And she goes through some somewhat crafty ways of doing it as well. Like, for example, when Jane and Bingley start to have this potential romance, then Mrs. Bennet says, "Oh, you should go over there right away and take a horse." And Jane's like, "Yeah, but it might rain. And so I want to take the coach." And she says, "Well, no, take the horse, because then if it rains, you'll have to stay there overnight." And so they'll have to put
Right.
you up in a room and have you give you more time over there. And Jane does end up getting sick from being in the rain for so long, and Mrs. Bennet's like, "Oh, great. Now she'll have even more time over there." So she's a character, but not exactly a character that you like. And I believe Jane Austen did that on purpose, because she was trying to show how ridiculous this time period was, that where women, the only value they could give to society was if they're married. And so she's taking the mom, the Miss Bennet, and saying, "You see how ridiculous this is when somebody acts like this? Well, why are we okay with it in society?" You know? And so that was kind of my interpretation of Miss Bennet, which makes her a more enjoyable character when you know that she's not supposed to be a person that you like.
Right. And she's so funny she's just so happy to get her daughters married, whether it's good circumstances or bad. Like, spoiler, there will be spoilers in this podcast. So
Absolutely.
when Lydia gets married to this man who it's a very questionable
Right, Wickham,
situation
yeah.
and quite scandalous. to the family, and the mom is just once they're married, the mom is just so happy. She doesn't want it's like all the terrible, the scandalous stuff that happened before the marriage that didn't happen. Her daughter's married, and that's all that matters, you know?
Right.
And then in the end, like right up until Elizabeth is engaged, she can't stand Mr. Darcy. And she, comes up with this plan for Elizabeth and Darcy to go on a walk just so that Jane and Mr.
Yeah,
Bingley, I'm
Bingley, yeah.
terrible with name. Yeah, thank you. Bingley can be alone. And she's like, I am so sorry, Elizabeth, that you have to be with this terrible man. Just you won't have to talk to him very much.
Right,
And
right.
when they get engaged, then suddenly she flips and is like, "Oh, he's wonderful. This is wonderful. I'm
And
so
he's so
happy that
rich. We're so happy for you. Yeah.
yeah, you're married. That's all that matters." You know?
Right.
Mm, and, I think when you put it that way that Jane was kind of making fun of that attitude and their culture, then it does make the book a lot more interesting, you know? Because 'Cause I'm like,
Right.
"Oh, okay, if she's making, kinda satire and kinda saying, 'Hey, look at this. This doesn't really make sense that we do this,' then I can agree with her."
Yeah. Yeah, and something to also kind of keep in mind is as we go throughout the story that the whole idea of the Regency time period where women just kind of had nothing to do and the men had nothing to do, that is an issue all as well, and that's something uh, that Elizabeth in the story kind of tries to fight. She's trying to show us that that's also ridiculous. Like, why can't women do more? And just a little bit of history on the time on the Regency era is that so women yes they could own property, and we'll get into that why that's important. But then also women they for the lower class women they could have jobs. They could be seamstresses or some just kind of some basic stuff. However, with the Bennets, because they are a slightly more higher class, just I think they were like what right below upper middle class. And so for any of them to go out and get a job would actually kind of bring their whole family down. It would be like, oh wow, they're so poor that they have to work, you know?
Yeah.
And
Oh, disgusting.
ridiculous. And so but then you get someone who's like Elizabeth and she's like, I like to go for walks because she doesn't like to live by the social norms that are pressed upon her. And so when she shows up to see Jane after she was sick, and she's all covered in mud, and she was probably sweaty, and her hair was all crazy because she just walked like 3 miles or something. So keep in mind that's like an hour long walk, and it was in the countryside. So and just after it rained, so it was gonna be it's muddy. So her dress is all muddy. And she probably humid, so maybe her hair got all kind of frizzy, and and so Miss so Bingley's sister is just like making fun of her because she just looks ridiculous. But Mr. Darcy's like, well, she does have nice eyes. And now we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but that's just to kind of show a little example of how Elizabeth is trying to show us that women they shouldn't be just viewed as someone that can get married. And now one more quick note about I'm just kind of trying to set the pace for the story so we can just kind of go on with the story. But it's interesting because so Mrs. Bennet, ridiculous as she does it all for a reason. If it wasn't for her daughters getting married, then they would, in a sense, when their father died, be homeless. Literally homeless. They would have to go live with family and they wouldn't be able to work because, like I said, then they would have to work for a living. How terrible is that? Which is just ridiculous. But all that is because, as I mentioned earlier, women they could own property in that time. But however, due to some of the different legal laws, and I won't talk too much on law because nobody likes law, but essentially, uh, was it Longbourn, the house that they all lived in, the Bennett's estate, it was entailed, which basically just means that when Mr. Bennett received the house, probably from his father, then part of the contract said that he would be able to live in it as long as he's alive and that it would be given to his firstborn child, his firstborn son. Well, his firstborn son, and that was the main thing. They had 5 daughters, no sons, which means that due to the legal paperwork, the signing of the lease, if you would, for the house or the estate, then because they didn't have a son, then the estate was going to go to the next male because that's just what it legally was. Now, granted, Mr. Bennett was planning to, when they had a son, that when the son was old enough, then they would change it all and say that the the estate would go to essentially his widow. So when or whoever else was kind of in line for it. So it wasn't going to be from one man to another. It was just going to be from it was just going to stay in the family in a sense. And but the problem is that they didn't have sons, and so they were going to lose the house. And Mrs. Bennett makes this big deal about how he should have fought for it earlier, and yes, he should have. And so that's one of the interesting little things that we have in this book is Mr. Bennett is he's just funny. He's a funny character, but he also seems kind of like oblivious and like just kind of distant. And then we have Mrs. Bennett, who is like just a helicopter parent, overboard, and always in everybody's business. And so you have these two parental figures that are totally different. And Elizabeth kind of sides more with her father. And oh, there's so much to talk about with her, just with her parents. Ooh, I'll collect my thoughts. Is there anything you wanted to add before I keep rambling?
No, no, I love your thoughts, and I think it's interesting, like I said, the different relationships Elizabeth had with them too. I think that's probably telling about what Jane Austen is trying to say with this book, because Elizabeth is definitely closer to her father than her mother,
Right,
right? And has more like respect for him, and other characters in the book don't necessarily respect her mother. Her poor mom.
right, right. Although that again though, that's the point. That's the point is that her mom isn't supposed to be liked because she's a representation of the Regency period. She's a representation of how ridiculous the societal rules were. And so what Jane Austen is doing is saying, look, you don't like this in a woman. Why would you like it in society? And I think she does a good job by personifying the society, and as which is fascinating. I think she did great.
Yeah, a really
Uh,
clever way to help people look at it in a different light.
right. Yeah, exactly. And
Sometimes we all need that for our blind spots.
yes, absolutely. And that's a big part of what this book is. It's about blind spots. And uh but for starters, we'll kind of start by just kind of going over a little bit the opening conversation uh that the Bennets have, where Mrs. Bennett starts talking about how she's so excited that a couple rich men moved into the neighborhood because this is their opportunity for their daughters to be taken care of and for them in turn also to be taken care of. Because again, if they lose the estate when their dad dies, then they live in poverty. They're homeless, they have to live with family or something, just all around a bad situation. And so the fact that now there's these two rich dudes that just showed up in the neighborhood, that's exciting for them. And Mrs. Bennett starts telling Mr. Bennett, she's like, okay, you've got to go and talk to them so that they can come over and we can all get to know each other. And our oldest daughter, Jane, can marry one of them. Straightforward. No ifs, ands, or buts to it. And Mr. Bennett's
We
like,
haven't even met them yet, but we're going to
right,
marry off our daughter to one of them.
right. One of them is going to marry our oldest daughter for sure. It's just funny. And then, and Mr. Bennett's like, uh, no, I won't. And Mrs. Bennet freaks out and she's like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Do you not care about our children? And then Mr. Bennett's like, okay, well, I guess I could talk to him, but I'll make sure I put in a good word for Elizabeth, because she's his favorite. And and then Miss Bennet's like, don't always favor Lizzie so much. You hate all of our other children. He's like, no, they're just not as smart as Lizzie is. So but then one of the lines I like from it is funny is as he's working Miss Bennet up into a frenzy, and she's like, "You have no compassion for my nerves," and he says, "Oh, I'm very well acquainted with your nerves. I've known them for the last 20 years." and and it's all just a fun, entertaining dialogue, but it's also ridiculous because it's setting the scene for the ridiculous nature of the time period in which they lived in. So and so that's the setting that we're in, is that the only value that these poor young girls had was if they were to get married, because that's how their family would be able to move on and progress. So so when these two rich fellas come in, then you have, I heard it kind of described as like if Mr. Bingley was kind of like a millionaire, then Mr. Darcy is like a billionaire. Like that it's just he makes way more than Bingley does. But Bingley is the one that Jane and that Jane kind of starts to fall for, and Bingley starts to fall for her. And it's all at a ball because that's where rich people go to make friends, is a ball. Whereas I guess the peasants go to a bar.
'Cause
But just a funny little aside, I guess.
and 'cause they have nothing else to do but go to balls.
Right, right. And and with that, I think the interesting thing is, so these women, they have lots to do, but it's things towards self-improvement, which is, awesome if it's for the right reasons. They're going around, they're learning instruments, they're learning to sing, they're reading a lot, but what's the purpose? The purpose is to make them more valuable investments for rich men, which is just terrible. Like I said,
Yeah,
great that they're improving
exactly.
themselves, but why?
It's kinda like today we have arm candy, you know what I mean? That
Right.
that phrase arm candy? It's kinda like that. I want a wife that is excellent at the piano and singing and drawing, not because she necessarily enjoys those things and gets pleasure from doing them. No, it's because it'll look good if my wife can do these things. They're valued in our culture,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
That's I mean, I love all those things, but I don't think anybody should be forced to do them just because that's what we do, you know?
Right. Right. And so you put all these people and you take them, they throw a ball, and uh like I said, Jane and Bingley, they start dancing and they're happy. They're having a good time. They're happy to be acquainted with each other. And then Bingley is talking to his friend Mr. Darcy, and he's like, "Hey, bro, why aren't you dancing with any of these cute girls?" He's like, and he doesn't know this, but Elizabeth is kind of just sitting off to the side and can overhear them. But so Mr. Bingley's like, he's like, I guess he's just Bingley. Well, I don't know why he's not Mr. Bingley. It's Mr. Darcy, and should be Mr. Bingley too, but they don't call him Mr. Bingley. I don't know. So we're gonna use it interchangeably. Deal with it. So we have Bingley and Jane, and they've been dancing, having a great time. And then, but Bingley and Jane, they notice that Elizabeth isn't dancing, and neither is Mr. Darcy. So they're trying to set them both up. And so Bingley goes and talks to Mr. Darcy, and now just as a quick kind of description, Mr. Darcy and Bingley are both described as handsome, tall, and rich. However, Mr. Darcy is kind of socially awkward, I think is a good way to put it. He seems to be more of an introvert. And so he's not good with people. And this shows when Bingley is talking to him and he says, "Why haven't you danced with any of these cute girls?" And he says, "Well, because I just don't know any of them and I don't really feel comfortable getting to know anybody." And Bingley's like, "Well, it's a ball. That's what you do. You're supposed to dance with people so you can get to know them." And he's like, "Well, what about Jane's sister? She seems nice." And he's like, she's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." In a sense, he just kind of said, "Eh," you know, she's eh. And so naturally rude. And Elizabeth hears this, and she's like, "Okay, I hate him." Simple, you know? I guess she doesn't hate him yet. She does later, but right now she's like, "I don't like him. He's a mean man, and he's prideful." And she's right on both accounts, at least from the first impression, which is kind of what we start looking at in this book is first impressions and then Pride and Prejudice. And I think we can start kind of diving into those themes throughout this book because I think we
Well,
got the setting set up.
I wonder now, seeing how he was at the end of the book, if his being so obnoxious in the beginning, because I did think he was really rude
Oh
at
yeah,
the ball, that maybe that was just his like kind of rejecting the times that he knew because he knows how they are, that they're assuming, oh, new men in town, they're going to try and marry us off, and he's just not have does not want any part of that, which is understandable. Maybe that's where that attitude was coming from. Do you
right.
think?
No, I think that's absolutely what it is. I think that he was, in a sense, I think it's twofold. I think one is that he saw through all the games. He's like, "Look, I don't wanna marry someone just because I have money and they need money." He's like, "That just sounds dumb." And and so I think right off the bat, he's just kinda put off from that. He's like, "Yeah, it's just not my kinda group. I don't wanna be here." And on top of that, I think when he sees Elizabeth, I think he is attracted to her, but I think instead of admitting his feelings right in the beginning, he's like, "You know what? I'm just gonna." He's like, I'm gonna lie. I'm gonna try to convince myself that she's not good enough for me because she's of such a lower social class." And so he uses his own prejudice, or he uses his own pride of being better than her to say, "Well, she's not worth my time anyways, even though she is kind of pretty." And so he's like, "Maybe if I get to know her, I might like her." But he's like, but he also knows, like you said, he's like, "Well, what's the point? They just want me for my money anyways." And so I think that's a good insight, and I think that's very accurate. Because as the story does go on, we do find out that he is actually a good person. And so this beginning is kind of weird how he's so rude, but
Yeah.
I think it is for what you said. I think that he's just kind of like, it's not my group, not my crowd.
Yeah, we could forgive him for that.
Right? We can because we know the story, but Elizabeth doesn't, and that's kind of
Well, and
the interesting thing.
she's the one insulted, so
Right.
she has a right to be more angry.
Right, and now one of the funny things about Elizabeth is that she prides herself on her ability to read a person and get kinda have a first impression and judge them based on that first impression. And so, when she sees Mr. Darcy and he's rude, then she's like, "Okay, first impression locked in. She's mean, or he's mean. He's prideful, mean, and I don't like him." And so throughout the book, she goes through this phase of convincing herself that she hates him because it's just kind of one thing after another. She starts to look at everything darkly for him. It's kinda, I think it's, Paul in the Bible at some point, he says that we see through a lens, we see through a glass darkly. And so she starts to see everything about Mr. Darcy in a darker shade and doesn't give him the benefit of the doubt, which is a bummer because if she did, she would have much sooner realized that, there's a lot of good traits he has. Although, at the same time, if she had given him the benefit of the doubt and realized that, then he wouldn't have had to go through the changes he had to make because he does have issues and he did have to change and he does. And that's what's interesting about this story is seeing the changes in both of them.
That's a good point. I like how you said that her first impression of him colored her, experiences with him that followed. Whereas if she'd had a good first impression, she would have seen those differently. You know what I mean? I think that's really interesting because, like, I do that sometimes when I'm like listening to somebody in church or watching a YouTube or something that is boring to me. And I think, well, what if that person was my friend? And I
Right.
understood that they're doing their best, and I would probably be cheering them on, even if it's not the best, YouTube I ever heard or the best talk or the best whatever. And it just helps me, suddenly if I think, well, if that was my friend, then it gives me a different point of view, a good kind of a bit of reframing, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that's just a really good point about Darcy. And something that we could all think about because I can think of a few people in my life where my first impression of them was terrible, who later actually did become friends because
Right.
sometimes you just
Wow.
meet somebody on a bad day, you know what I mean,
Right.
or whatever. So that's an interesting thing to think about. I'm glad you've mentioned that.
Yeah. And it's kind of fun because it sets up the story for a um enemies to lovers theme. And people love that theme. And I think that's a large reason that people love Pride and Prejudice is because they love that enemies to lovers theme. It's I like to call
That
it
makes sense. I do
yeah,
enjoy that.
right. And I like to call it the kindergarten flirting because when you're in kindergarten or elementary school, what do you do when you like somebody? You make fun of them. If you're a guy, you hit them. And
Right.
or even if you're a girl, you hit them. So it's just it's you don't know how to show your emotions right, and so what you do is you kind of lash out at them. And that's what they do in this book. They just kind of beat each other up the whole time until all of a sudden they're like, "Wait, I love you," and then Elizabeth is shocked, and she's like, "Wait a second, all this time, all this time I thought he was the most like unbearable person in the world, and the whole time he's like, he loves me for what? And and I think that when that happens, and she's like, oh shoot, I've been totally misjudging him. And then she also, and then Mr. Darcy also writes her a letter and helps kind of clear up some issues that they had. There's so many things going on in this book. Okay, so now before we get too far ahead of ourselves, there's two more male characters that we got to throw into the mix. And to start off, we have Mr. Wickham, who we meet, and then he's a soldier, and I guess he had known Mr. Darcy's family, and due to some drama, he tells Elizabeth how horrible Mr. Darcy is because Mr. Darcy was responsible for him losing his opportunity to be a member of the clergy at a church. And because Elizabeth is so focused on how she doesn't like Mr. Darcy, then she just believes everything that Wickham says. And when she talks to Jane about it, her sister, then Jane is like, well, maybe you should hear out Mr. Darcy. Maybe you should hear his side of the story. There's got to be some reason for everything that happened. And Elizabeth is like, yeah, there is reason. He's a jerk and he's too prideful. And so she has this prejudice placed on him. And so because of that, then she has these blind spots. There's a blind spot to all of his good qualities. And so she just views, and so now she's like, okay, first he was mean to me. Now he's mean to Wickham. And then later in the story, he ends up breaking up Bingley and Jane because, as Mr. Darcy saw it, then Bingley liked Wickham, liked Jane way more than she liked him, and so he was just trying to save his friend. In a sense, in a 2023 kind of phrase, maybe I don't know, maybe it's more of a 2016. I'm trying to think back to when I was in college and in the dating realm. Uh, Basically, what Mr. Darcy is saying, he's saying, bro, she doesn't like you the way you like
Yeah,
her, and
she's just not that into you.
right. Nope. Like you're wasting your time. Plus, her family is crazy. Think about the mother-in-law you'll have. And in a sense, that's what he tells her. What he tells him, he's like, and Bingley's like, oh shoot, well, you really don't think she likes me? And he's like, yeah, bro, it's not working out. And so he's trying to just be a good friend and help him out. And so then when Elizabeth tells him, he's like, dude, she was crazy about him. He's like, oh man, I messed up. Okay. And then Mr. Darcy does go and he makes amends, which is huge because if Mr. Darcy truly was as proud as Elizabeth thought he was, then he wouldn't let someone of a lower class tell him that he was wrong. And so
Yeah,
he
that's
he
true.
humbles himself and he's like, I was wrong. Okay. And he goes and he tries to fix it. And that's something that everyone likes about Mr. Darcy is that he's prideful, but he also is able to step back and humble himself and say and realize when he's been wrong. And so that's Wickham. Wickham is in there. And while we're talking about Wickham, let's just talk about Wickham. So
Okay, wait.
yeah.
Just a brief sidebar
Mhm.
is I was thinking about. It's funny. I always think about the title. I always thought that like, who's one's prejudice and one's prideful. Like
Uh-huh.
Elizabeth is prejudiced and Darcy is prideful. But now I
Right.
realize they both have a little bit of both going on, right? Which
Yes.
I can't believe I didn't see that before. But then the other thing I was thinking about that you brought to my mind was how she accepted the information about Mr. Darcy that complemented what she already believed. Even
Right.
when Jane
Yeah.
said, well, maybe you should explore this a little bit more. She's like, no, no, this is what I believe. And this fits in with what I believe. And I just think like kind of psychological what's the word I want? Bent? Anyway,
Yeah.
that's something we all need to be careful about is only accepting information about, I'm thinking about politics,
Right.
that
Right.
agrees with what we already believe, that we should try to be a little more open-minded, whether it's politics or people or whatnot, to just, be a little more critical thinking and consider things that are outside the realm of what we already believe about a person or a subject. So I just think that's a interesting takeaway,
Yeah. No, that's a great
and
point.
that we are also all full of pride and prejudice, you know?
Right. Yeah. I love that
So
because it's so true that we often look for things, self-confirming bias is kind of what you're saying, which is
Yes.
where you have this opinion on something and then you hear something that goes along with it and you believe it, even though it might not be true, because it confirms your own personal bias. And that's totally what she does. You're right, is that she has this bias that Mr. Darcy is prideful and just terrible. And so anything that complements that, then she's like, "Great, I was right." And so that feeds her pride in herself, saying that I was right about Mr. Darcy. And so therefore, my judgments that I'm so fond of, that I do so good with, I'm right again. And so yes, so she has that pride, and you're
Yeah,
right.
and later when she finds out who Wickham really is, she asks herself,
Hmm.
"Oh, why didn't I see this and this and there?" Like, looking back, she could see that there are signals that she shouldn't have believed him, but she
Right.
ignored them because it confirmed what she already believed.
Yeah.
And we all do that. It's just a I like how, in books help us see things about ourselves, and that's definitely one of those things we could see in ourselves
Yeah.
and be better at. So
No, that's
anyway,
true.
back to Wickham.
Well, no, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a major theme. I guess it's not a theme, but it's a major topic in this story, is the self-confirming biases that uh, kind of ruin our lives, if you would, at least ruin our opportunities. And but yeah, and so Wickham, he he's a soldier, and he comes into the story, and you think he's a good character because he seems good, and Elizabeth, being great with her impressions, also thinks he's good. Although Jane, her older sister, is kind of, I think she sees through him a bit and is like, you shouldn't just take everything he says at face value. Mr. Wickham kind of strikes me as a narcissist, is that he's very focused on how great he is and how everyone else, if they do anything wrong to him, is because they had some problem with him, not that he had anything wrong with himself. And so he's kind of your like stereotypical kind of smooth, kind of suave, narcissistic guy that are in a lot of these romance stories. Um, and fortunately, he doesn't end up with the main character in this story, which is great because I always hate that. But he does end up with Elizabeth's sister, and that's a big issue because in that time period, that was like something that not only shamed I think it was Lydia, the youngest sister. So she's like 16. And now granted, I know that today that's terrible as ew. Uh Time period, guys, time period. We have to remember the time period. And we can't judge people based on their beliefs of what was right and wrong. So we know that's wrong, but they for it was perfectly okay for them. Granted, think about this. Jane Austen herself, she died at 41, and that's not unheard of in that time period. For us, being married at 16 is terrible, wrong, illegal, because we live until we're like 70 to 100 years old. In that time period, people were lucky to make it to 50. So
So
we
getting married at
gotta
16 was a lot more acceptable.
right, we gotta give our ancestors a little bit of grace. They were doing the best with the knowledge that they had. And so the fact that she got married at 16 in this story does show that, yeah, it was too early, but it wasn't terrible. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't criminal. However, it was a stain on the family because of how she did it. She didn't go through the process. She ran off with Wickham, followed their platoon to London or something, and basically eloped. And now, and that,
Well, and even
yeah.
more scandalous, they lived together for a little while before they got married, which
Oh, that's true.
today people don't think anything of it, but back then that was a scandal.
Right, back then, you don't show your ankles. And so
Right. And yeah,
yeah,
so
and
if you
so
don't
that's
show your
true.
ankles, you definitely don't live together before you get married.
Mhm, exactly, and so the fact that they eloped, it not only put a stain on Lydia, it put a stain on her whole family, which would, if Darcy truly was this prideful, arrogant person, then that would give him even more reason to be like, "Oh, wow, Elizabeth, your family is messed up. I don't wanna be with you at all." But he puts that behind him, and he even in turn goes and helps in that situation. Well, and we'll come back to that because I think there's a lot to be said about how he goes about and helps Lydia and Wickham. And so we'll come back to that. But first, unless there's anything you want to add, we'll talk about Mr.
Oh,
Collins.
just really
Yeah.
briefly, along with the self-confirming bias thing,
Mhm.
I think it's interesting that as readers, Elizabeth has a certain view of Darcy, and we like Darcy, right? Because I mean, we like Elizabeth because she's the main character, and
Right.
so we like her. So we go along with her about what she thinks of Wickham,
Yeah.
rather than you know being more suspect like Jane,
Right.
which is something we do tend to do in real life too. If our friend tells us that somebody is no good, then we go, "Yeah, you're right. They're no good." You know,
Yeah, exactly.
just one of those prejudices to watch out for in ourselves.
Right. And it's interesting because it's such a good example that even just in this story, we already get a confirming bias. Like you said, that we're taking the side of Elizabeth, even though we don't know the other sides. But we're like,
Yeah,
hey, Elizabeth is our friend, and so we're gonna side with her, even though we don't know everything
yeah,
else yet. And so that's a
exactly.
good point.
Yeah. So Mr. Collins, oh, he's a character.
Right.
Yeah. You want to introduce Mr. Collins first?
Yes. So Mr. Collins, this he the way I like to call I describe him as a goober. He's just a dork. He's awkward when they meet at the first dance. He can't dance. He's stumbling all over. He's stepping on Elizabeth's feet and just making a total fool of himself. But he doesn't see it like that. He's just trying. But he does now. He's a goof, but he does seem like a very kind person. He seems very kind, which you got to give to him. But he's just not the smartest tool. He's not. He's just not the sharpest tool in the shed.
That's true.
Uh,
He's awkward. He's terribly awkward, but he's not
right.
unkind.
Right.
That's a good point.
And and so now a little bit of background for Mr. Collins is Mr. Collins is effectively Elizabeth's cousin. Um, I don't understand the whole family dynamic. It doesn't matter. But what does matter is that uh, the house, the Bennett estate, is going to go to Mr. Collins when the father dies. And so the fact that Mr. Collins is coming and saying, "Hey, you know what? I will marry one of your daughters, specifically Elizabeth. That way the estate can stay in the family." That's actually incredibly generous and something that's very kind of him to do is to be thinking about their family in such a degree that he's like, "Hey, look, I'll marry one of you guys. That way everything can kind of stay as it is." So, seems nice. But the problem is that he chose the wrong daughter. He chose Elizabeth, and Elizabeth she has this what we see today as a correct view on love, which is that you've got to love somebody, or a correct view on marriage is that which is you got to love somebody to marry them. Um, and now that's kind of unheard of in that time. And there's actually a quote that I wanted to read from you, or read to you from I think it was from Catherine, who ends up marrying Mr. Collins after like a day. But anyways, so I think both these quotes are from Catherine. If not, I'm sorry, but deal with it. So she says, "Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance." And then, um, I'll save that next one for a moment. But so what she's saying is that, like, hey, look, you're going to if you when you get married, you might be happy, you might not. You just never know, because that's not the point of marriage in those days, which is just ridiculous. But yes, so Mr. Collins is trying to be very gracious, and he tells Elizabeth how he's so qualified to be married, and he has all this fortune, and he's going to inherit her house, and so we should get married. And Elizabeth is like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold up!" And even before even before he started this proposal, then Collins was like talking to Mrs. Bennet. He's like, "Hey, can I talk to Elizabeth sometime later?" And Mrs. Bennet's like, "Okay, everybody out right now." He's like, "Well, we can wait a minute." She's like, "Nope, everybody out." And Elizabeth, seeing what's coming, she's like, "No, there's no reason everyone needs to go. We can all stand here and just have a chat." But Mr. Collins proposes marriage, and Elizabeth says, "I'm sorry, but absolutely not. That is not happening." I think she says that we could never be happy, and there's no one who you'd be more unhappy with than me, something like that. And he's like, and so he's like
Right.
shocked
It,
because that
I
doesn't
think she's
happen.
right too.
Right. But he's just, like, totally dumbfounded because that doesn't happen in this time period. When a rich man comes and says, "Hey, I wanna marry you," even though you come from a kinda questionable family, you say, "Awesome." But now Mr. Collins is like, "Wait, she said no." And and so then he has this whole dialogue with her about how, "Oh, well, okay, well, I get it. You're just saying no because I know how the female mind is that sometimes when you say no, you really mean yes, and you just wanna let the feelings grow and build a little bit longer. So I'll come back in a couple weeks." And she says, "No, no, nope. My feelings will be just as strongly no as they are now. So no, don't waste your time. It's not gonna work out." And oh man. And then and so poor Mr. Collins, just he's a nice guy, but he's just dumb. And so he leaves. He does take the rejection, which good for him. I'm glad he did, even though it was harder than it should have been. But so Mr. Collins
That scene
does.
was so funny, though.
I know, right? It's just
Bless his heart.
and now that's one of the things that people love about Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen is that her dialogue is so genuine and her humor is actually very kind of on point. She does a great job with her humor. And so Mr. Collins, he leaves, and then I think in like the next couple days, he starts talking to Catherine, who's Elizabeth's friend. She's like the ripe old age of 27 or something like that. And so I joke about the ripe old age because basically she was all set to just see herself as a single woman for the rest of her life because she was too old. And so when Mr.
No,
Collins
27, old maid.
Right, right, and so when Mr. Collins comes to her and he's like, "Hey, you wanna get married?" Then she's like, "Yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it." And and granted, they don't really like to be around each other all that much, but she is pregnant by the end of the novel, so there's that. Um, but but yeah, and so it just shows that Catherine is was Elizabeth's great friend, and so Elizabeth is like, Why did you marry him?" And she's like, "Why didn't you?" And but then a funny dialogue comes in when Mrs. Bennet talks to Mr. Bennet about how terrible it is that Elizabeth didn't marry Mr. Collins. And so Mrs. Bennet's like, "Mr. Bennet, I can't believe what just happened. Mr. Collins came and so graciously proposed to Elizabeth, and and she said no, she rejected him, and you have to tell her that she has to marry him, or I'll never see her again." And so Mr. Bennet says, "Okay, all right, send her in." And now Miss Bennet is excited. She's like, "He's listening to me. This is great. This never happens." And she's right. It never happens because Elizabeth comes in and Mr. Bennet kind of sternly is like, "All right, well, I hear that Mr. Colin proposed to you and you said no. Is that true?" And she's like, "Yes, I don't love him." And he's like, "Okay, well then you find yourself in a difficult position. If you refuse Mr. Collins, then you will never see your mother again. But if you accept his proposal, then I will never see you again." and and so it's just and so now Elizabeth is excited because she's like, "Great, dad agrees. That's what matters." And her mom does move on and it turns out okay for her and her mother, but it's just another example of the kind of comedic clash between the social expectations represented in Miss Bennet and kind of logic and reason and romance. Um, although I'm not saying that Mr. Bennet is a classic example of romance because he's not, but what he stands for is that you should love somebody if you're going to marry them. So that's kind of the Mr. Collins uh, little dialogue there, which is just kind of a classic that's you got to include in it. Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, no, I think you covered that one well. I think that was a particularly funny scene. I mean,
Right.
that was one of the things I noticed this time around reading it that I didn't remember before, is that there were times it really made me laugh. So
Yeah.
that was fun. That was that whole thing about Mr. Collins and her dad's reaction. Yeah,
Right.
good stuff.
Yeah. So the book is packed full of little conversations like this too. It's just the comedic uh breaks, I guess, if you would. And so now Elizabeth has been proposed to by Collins. She kind of had this like opportunity to almost be proposed to by Wickham, I believe. I think he was trying to decide if he liked her or not, but kind of she distanced herself from him, and he ended up going with her younger sister. And again, scandal. And now and now before we kind of wrap up and finish up the story, we've got to talk about was it Lady Catherine de Burgh or de Burgh? I don't know how her name is pronounced. Uh
Definitely, we gotta talk about Lady Catherine.
she's just such a terrible person. And that's the point, is she's supposed to be someone you don't like. When I was listening to this book on Audible, then I was like, wait a minute. This lady's rude, mean, offering her opinion in all places that it isn't asked for, and thinks that she
Trying to
knows
force
everything.
her opinion on people.
Right. And I was like, and did they say her name was Catherine? And so then a quick Google search later, I was like, wait a minute. This woman, I believe, is the first example in English literature she's the first Karen, because Karen is a shortened version of Catherine. And she's literally a Karen. She's old enough to be a Karen. She forces her opinion on people, and she's loud and annoying.
And she
She's the
comes
first
barging
Karen.
in and she expects people to do
Yeah.
what she says. It's
Right. And so I was like, no way. I was like, Jane Austen wrote the first Karen in English literature. And I say the
that
first
is
because
hilarious.
I'm sure there are women who are Karens in other literature, and other classics. But the fact that her name was Catherine, so she could be called Karen, she's the first Karen. So now anytime someone says Karen, I'm going to think Jane Austen. I don't know if that's where it comes from, but it does for me now. So, and I'm going to start telling
That's
people that's where it
hilarious.
comes from. And maybe we can all spread that, and people will start to believe that she should get the credit,
Right?
because it's just so funny. And so there really isn't too much to go off of um with Karen, except for that when except for that her moments in the book are just terrible. She's just mean. Now, and so we'll just kind of cut through those. If you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read the book, you'll find out when you read it. But she does play a part in this story when after Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth and is, totally rude in his proposal. He's like, against my better judgment, I still want to marry you, even though your family is really kind of terrible and you're such a lower social class than I am. I will still
Yeah,
lower myself and marry you.
that was
You know?
pretty obnoxious proposal.
Right. And then she says no. And again, he's shocked because you don't do that. You don't say no to a billionaire who wants to marry you and take care of you and your family. And so he's like, wait, she said no. And so Elizabeth, she just likes to break the social norms. And with all these good reasons, because she talks about how he was rude to her. He talks about how she ruined Mr. Wickham's life. She talks about how he ruined Bingley and Jane's relationship. And when she says all these things, he's like, whoa, your opinion of me is really based on these things. And he's like, and they're all somewhat true. And so he realizes this, and he goes and he says, in a sense, he's like, sorry that I wasted so much of your time. And it's a kind of sad moment, but he goes and he changes. He does what he can to make things better in the ways that he can. That's one of the great things about Mr. Darcy, is that he doesn't just say, "Oh wow, this girl, I was right about her. She is lower than me, and I should have just told myself that and moved on." But he says,
Yeah, and
"No,
this
she
is an
was right.
example of how she's lower than me. Look
Right,
how she responded to me.
right. Look at how
Which,
she
yeah,
didn't even value my gracious offer of marriage.
which is, and if he had done that, that's typically what people do, what we all do.
Right?
So that he rose above that is really impressive because oftentimes we don't rise above those moments in our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And so he's just great character. And now, but that leaves them in this kind of weird
But
limbo.
Wickham wasn't his fault. He
That's
didn't
true.
wrong Wickham.
Right, and
The other stuff the other stuff was true, but
right, and so let's talk about that. So after this happens, then Mr. Darcy, he feels bad, and his pride is hurt, and so he writes Elizabeth a letter explaining everything. Sorry, explaining everything that she had said, and all of the things that she accused him of. And so in that letter, he talks about how he talks about how yes, he did break up Bingley and Jane, and we talked about that. So he
Yeah.
explains that, and but
She's just not that into you.
right, but he does go and he tells Bingley, he's like, "Hey, dude, I was wrong. Apparently, she really loved you. She would marry you if you asked." And so later in the story, Bingley does come back and he does propose, and they do get married. And so Mr. Darcy does save that relationship that he sabotaged. And
He
now,
righted his wrong.
right. And so he fixes that. He's like, okay, I was wrong. So he goes and fixes it. Great. Good for him. But then, and then there's Wickham, who essentially, Wickham was just a bad person. He didn't want to be in the clergy. He didn't have a good reputation. And if I'm remembering right, he tried to elope with Mr. Darcy's younger 15-year-old sister. And Mr.
Yep.
Darcy's like, dude, that's not going to happen. And so he, in a sense, uh, tarnishes his reputation and scares him off. And so Mr. Darcy saves his sister and ruins Mr. Wickham's reputation. And then, so now Mr. Wickham is uh, no longer a valued member of society, which good because he wasn't. And so Mr. Darcy wasn't in the wrong in trying to defend his family. But the thing is that we didn't know that. We, the readers, and we with Elizabeth, we didn't know that background story. And so we just thought that he was just a mean man that just didn't like him. But along with that makes what happens next in the story all the more impressive because
I was just thinking that.
yeah, because when Wickham and Lydia run off together, then keep in mind this is the time where either the man has to have money or the woman has to have some sort of a dowry, some sort of a money that the dad will pay to basically say, "Hey, take my daughter, take care of her." And so now Lydia, she didn't have any dowry, and Mr. Wickham didn't really have enough funds to support them. And so the whole family was afraid that they were going to run off and be together, but not get married. Because the only thing worse than running off and being together and living together is doing all that and then not getting married. And so Mr. Darcy, he goes and he finds out where they were staying. He finds Mr. Wickham and he tells him, "Hey, look, I'll pay you basically £10,000 and I'll pay you a little bit each month, but you've got to marry her." And I think they kind of argued about the prices and everything for a little while. And then, and so then Wickham says, "Okay, I'll marry her." And Mr. Darcy went to their wedding to make sure that Wickham showed up and make sure that he did marry her. And so he did everything he could to make things right. And he did even more by not telling anybody. The whole family thought that it was their uncle that took care of everything until one day they found out that no, it was actually Mr. Darcy came through and he paid for everything, he took care of everything, and he made sure that things would be settled and safe. And he didn't even tell anybody about it. He did all these things for Elizabeth, and he didn't even tell her that he was doing it. So he saw his faults and his wrongs and saw that he needed to improve and change because he wanted to deserve the love of this woman. And he didn't do it to be loved by her, but he did it so he could be someone who could be loved by her.
Yeah,
And
not
that's great.
to impress her because he didn't mean for her to know,
Right. Exactly.
just to help her family. And you know what I realized just now that I didn't realize reading the book? That Mr. Wickham, I think both times with both girls, that was a form of blackmail. Like
Oh
he
yeah, huh.
ran off with Lydia. Lydia thought they were going to get married the whole time. But
Right.
then when they get there, they weren't getting married.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
And so then the
true.
family comes and Wickham's like, we've got an interesting situation. Well, maybe I'll marry her and, make things better if you pay me. And
Right.
I think he was going to do the same thing with Mr. Darcy's sister.
Yeah.
That was
No,
his
that's a good
first
point.
plan to get money out of that family. So he's just a creep. Wickham is just a creep.
Right.
But Darcy is awesome because he didn't have to pay all that money. And I like what you said. He wanted to be the kind of man that Elizabeth could love, but at the same time, he wasn't trying to impress her because he didn't mean for her to know that he did that.
Right.
He wasn't the one that told her.
Exactly. And he didn't want to tell her. He wanted her to not know that he did it. And and so it shows that in the end, he is deserving of that relationship that they have. And so in the end of the book, then it's a happy ending. We get and we have all these different types of marriages, which is something that my mom mentioned that we should talk about, and I think she's totally right. Is that we have these interesting marriages. There's the Bennett's marriage, and then there's Lydia and Wickham's marriage, and Colin and Catherine, and then there's Jane and Bingley and Elizabeth and Darcy, and they all have their own unique aspects to all of them. Um, I think Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Bennett, they are basically just a perfect example of the time period, getting married to someone because they can take care of you. They're not friends, they don't really like each other, but they tolerate each other because they have to, is essentially what their relationship is. And then you have Colin and Catherine and or Collins, and they're kind of the same thing where it's like, you know what, we can take care of each other, and so we'll be happy enough.
Yeah, good enough.
Right.
How
It'll do.
sad.
And so and then you have Lydia and Wickham, who I think by the end of the novel they don't even like each other anymore, which I think speaks to the fact of don't get married to someone before you know them.
Well, I think the thing with Lydia and Wickham is they're still trying to Lydia's letter to congratulate Elizabeth on her
Mhm.
engagement was basically still asking for money. Like,
Right.
they're just gonna spend their life together groveling for money or something. I don't know. Maybe they're fit for each other. It was hard to tell, but
Yeah.
yeah, definitely not good circumstances to get married under.
Yeah, absolutely. So and then you have kind of the two pinnacle relationships in the book, which is Jane and Bingley and Elizabeth and Darcy. Is between the two of them, they did a good job. They both married someone that they all mutually loved and they seemed to have a good relationship. The difference was uh, in the chasing of the relationship. So so Bingley and Jane, their relationship came kind of the normal way. They knew that they were supposed to get married because of the situation, and they met at a ball. They danced and they danced and they kept on dancing effectively until they were married. And that was kind of what's expected in that time. But she also got more than she expected because she actually liked Bingley and they actually were happy together and they did love each other and they do. And so that's a great example of relationship for that time frame. And so I think that's Jane Austen's way of saying, look, I know that not all relationships are bad. It's not they're not always terrible. And so here's an example of a great one. And and so yeah, that's kind of what I take from that. What do you think?
No, I think you're right. It's kind of like I look at Jane and Bingley as kind of like arranged marriage because I think still today some cultures do arranged marriages and historically they did, and I think that some of those marriages did end up being happy. Jane and Bingley that can at times work. Although I'm grateful more to have the model of Elizabeth or Darcy where you actually fall in love first.
Right. And sometimes it's a journey. It's a journey to fall in love with each other sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. Those are some of my favorite romances. Like, I mean, in real life, couples that I've seen that they start out. I remember before I was married, all my friends are single that age, college age, right?
Mhm.
And I had a couple friends, they were like best friends and we're all like, when are you gonna get married? And they're like, "Ah, we're not gonna get married. We don't even like each other. We're the rest of us are like, yeah, you do. You just
Right.
can't see it. I don't know why they couldn't. It wasn't just that we were wanted them to get married. We could see that they cared for each other. And eventually they did get married. But I thought to me those are the sweetest kind of relationships when it starts out as friendship that turns into more. I like that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Elizabeth and Darcy were with a little bit more kind of hostile emotions in there. But it's the same
Yeah.
idea is that they both cared for each other this whole time, but Mr. Darcy was masking it with pride and prejudice and Elizabeth was masking with hatred and dislike until they finally realized that those lenses that we've been looking through, they really aren't the reality. And so when they took them off, then they realized that they would be really happy together if they would just let themselves be. And so they did. They did just let themselves be happy with each other. And they ended up getting married. And now they're all really happy together. And I think that's true in all of our lives is that we can all be happy with a lot of different people if we allow ourselves to be. But at the same time, you also can't force it. So it has to feel right and be natural, but ultimately just get out of your own way.
And you do wanna be careful that the partner you choose is not like a Wickham, you know what I mean?
Right. Not someone
Sometimes
that's
there are those
sneaky and
w
trying to hide.
yeah, those wolves in sheep's clothing, because nobody
Mhm.
can make a relationship work with someone like that.
Right, exactly. I think it's a great book. I'm glad that we got to read it again because I got a lot more from it this time. What do you think?
Me too. Well, I liked it a lot better this time, and I think I may read another Jane Austen in the future. No
Right?
promises, but I might.
Right.
So that's progress. Because last time I was like, "Yeah, I'm done."
Yeah, so maybe
So,
we'll both read another Jane Austen and then we'll discuss it on another episode
yeah,
of Shrinking Classics.
yes, and we hope you'll all be there with us.
Right. And so this has been fun. I hope that we've helped. Maybe you're writing a paper, or maybe you're just having a discussion, or maybe it's just one of your favorite books. If it's one of your favorite books, hopefully we didn't, mess anything up too bad. But I think I enjoyed this conversation, and I'm glad that I was able to have this conversation with my mom. And I hope that anyone watching will enjoy it and tune in next time. Any closing thoughts?
No, well, we're just glad you're here with us and hope to see you again in the future.
Great. Well, been wonderful having you on Shrinking Classics and hope that you will check in and see what we're reading for next week.